So the Venn diagram I just shared with you all is my me search. There was so very little research out there about us, by us, for us. And so I embarked on a journey of me search, which then became we search. And along the way, I found problematic language. And so I want to name this. And this comes from my friends who are social activists. Your condition is not your identity. Say it with me, please. My condition is not my identity. My condition is not my identity. And so I no longer call the descendants of abducted and enslaved Africans as slaves. Your ancestors were not slaves. Something happened to them. Your ancestors were enslaved. Yeah. And in a similar way, I'm not a refugee. My parents weren't refugees. My people weren't refugees. We sought refuge. My family sought refuge. And for the first dozen times that phrase came out of my mouth, I would just burst into tears because my humanity returned to me. And, says Vietnamese American author Viet Thanh Nguyen, I was once a refugee, although no one would mistake me for being a refugee now. Because of this, I insist on being called a refugee, since the temptation to pretend that I am not a refugee is strong. It would be so much easier to call myself an immigrant, to pass myself off as belonging to a category of migratory humanity that is less controversial, less demanding, and less threatening than the refugee. The photo on the left is my refugee camp intake photo, and this is the first photo that I have of myself, the earliest photo that I have of myself. And here on the right is a photo from my website. And for most of my life, when people would ask me, where are you from? Or where are your people from? Or how did you come to be in Australia? I would say, oh, we're from Vietnam. And I would be just squeezing myself in so tight, hoping that that would satiate whatever need that person had around how I looked. Because I did not want to name the conditions that gave rise to the circumstances around which my family sought refuge. So the United Nations definition of who seeks refuge. So there's a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons. And because of these reasons, this person is now outside the family of their nationality or habitual residence and is unable or, owing to such fear, unwilling to avail themselves to the protection of that country. And so at mid-2020, before the Ukrainian crisis happened, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees estimated that over 80 million individuals were forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. This does not include internally displaced folks, so folks who are inside the country of their nationality. And of this number, 40 to 50% of those who are in need of refuge are children. And we all hear that children are resilient, but we're not. We need protection. And I used to tell myself that we made it through what we made it through because we made it through together. And yet I'm not supposed to make it through things with my parents. My parents are supposed to protect me from the things that we went through. And yet we made it through what we made it through because we made it through together. And so I cite research by Anna Freud, who studied the children who were impacted during World War II by the bombings on London. And she studied these children prospectively, longitudinally over time. And there were two groups. There were the children who stayed in London with their parents during the World War II bombings of London. And then there were the children who were sent away to the safety of the countryside, away from the bombings and yet away from their parents. And across all domains of socioeconomic and psychological development, the folks who fared better over time were the folks who stayed in the danger of London and yet they were with their parents. We need to stop the barbaric practice of separating families. This man is Harold Napoleon. He's an Alaska Native elder from the wild western coast of Alaska, and he was the first of his people to get a Western education and eventually became a tribal leader who represented Alaska Natives at the state and at the federal level. And about 15 years ago, I heard an interview with Harold Napoleon, and he said something that really struck me. He said, Alaska Native women and children are fleeing the villages, certain villages of rural Alaska, like refugees. And I'd never heard anyone use the word refugees outside of my context. But in that moment, the definition of who seeks refuge expanded and lateralized. So it's anyone whose current safety issues leads them to fear for their future, and they embark into the unknown seeking refuge. There's likely systemic violence and oppression due to a marginalized identity. This includes our queer youth in certain parts of the world. This includes leaving, like anyone leaving an oppressive, abusive, addicted family system embedded within a closed community. And those who are leaving a cult or extreme religious fundamentalism. And so I ask you and invite you to hold these individuals and populations in mind as we begin to discuss the journey of seeking refuge. I just invite a pause here and a breath, because I know what it's like to see my life and my family's life on a series of PowerPoint slides. And I learned about this through a presentation that was given by a psychologist who worked for the Center for the Victims of Torture. So the journey of seeking refuge. And you can place your family lineage within this journey. So there's pre-flight conditions, flight conditions, resettlement conditions, and secondary migration. So pre-flight is the social, political, economic, and environmental forces that make home conditions unlivable into the unforeseeable future. People leaving family of origin violence. Yeah. Queer youth. Yeah. Political oppression. How many of your neighbours would need to disappear into the middle of the night? How many of your relatives would need to be violated? This is all part of the landscape. And how long would that need to go on for before you made the decision to leave everything and everyone you've ever known and taking your children along with you? Flight is the exit itself, risking danger in order to get out. And this is the most precarious and most vulnerable part of the refuge seeking journey. This is where youth get preyed upon by human traffickers. This is where particularly the young women who are fleeing Ukraine get predated upon by human traffickers. Because here's the thing, drugs you can sell once, humans you can sell over and over and over again. This is where we're so desperate to get out that we will chase any possible route in order to get out, risking our lives, trusting people who are dangerous in the hopes of being able to get out. Resettlement is making it to somewhere safe and starting a new life. However, for some of us, resettlement is a series of stopping points in homes, in safe houses, in refugee camps. And it can also be resettlement in another country. And then secondary migration is finding supportive community, forging a new life together and healing. It can be being with people who get what it's like and don't need to talk about it, and yet we get it. And perhaps at some point, 20, 30 years later, our children may heal, or perhaps we may heal. Because part of secondary migration is re-establishing yourself somewhere new, starting from the bottom. Or perhaps if you had education elsewhere that can translate to where you are now, then it's a little bit easier. Mm-hmm.